Good evening, everybody, all 700 odd of you, amazingly, and welcome to this virtual Guardian Live event, which marks the Guardian's 200th birthday. The Guardian was founded all those years ago in 1821 in Manchester. I'm John Harris. I'm a Guardian writer and columnist. I was born in Manchester, in the centre of Manchester, and I grew up 12 or 13 miles away from my sins in suburban Cheshire, with a deep affinity and love for the city throughout my time in that part of the world, which endures. And I write about Manchester a lot. For the next 75 minutes, I'll be your host as we explore and celebrate the city and its history, the radical elements of that history, Manchester's progressive politics, and its music and culture. Benjamin Disraeli, the Victorian Prime Minister, said Manchester was as great a human exploit as Athens. Helen Pankhurst, the campaigner for women's suffrage, who we'll be hearing a lot about in a moment, said that Manchester is a city which has witnessed a great many stirring episodes, especially of a political character. She went on, generally speaking, its citizens have been liberal in their sentiments, defenders of free speech and liberty of opinion. 2011, one very perceptive journalist said Manchester is an assertive, restless, almost republican city in an increasingly disunited kingdom. And the late and much missed Tony Wilson, who perhaps came up with the idea of 21st century Manchester before it actually existed, very famously summed up Manchester in 8 words. This is Manchester, he said. We do things differently here. Now, we shouldn't get too romantic about things. Like any city, Manchester has had its share of social problems and political controversies. It's seen plenty of tragedy and collective sadness, but it's a city that came to prominence all those years ago as one of the most future-facing places on earth, and it arguably remains so. To once again quote Tony Wilson, Manchester was the world's first industrial city, and it became arguably its first successful, consciously post-industrial city. So in that spirit, we're going to dive into Manchester's past and future, and we're going to begin by looking at the Guardian's Mancunian roots as the Manchester Guardian, and the important role the city played in the founding of the Guardian. I'll be joined by a great mix of guests this evening: Guardian editor Katharine Viner, the activists and campaigners Helen Pankhurst and Mark Fletcher, the musicians Tim Burgess and Afro Deutscher, and a little later on, the freshly re-elected Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham. A few words of housekeeping before we get started. This is quite an unusual event in that I'm interviewing a total of 6 people in about an hour. All our guests this evening will be coming back together at the end, a bit like at the end of a chat show on TV, to answer some of your questions. It won't just be me asking the questions. Some of you have sent questions in advance. Thank you very much for sending those in. If you'd like to put a question forward at any point, you can do so using the Q&A box. And you can also have the option to like other people's questions, maybe bump them up the rankings a bit, and get through as many favourites as possible. So I'm now going to move to our first guest, Katharine Viner. Kath is the Guardian's editor-in-chief. She's joining us from Manchester this evening, where she has spent all day commemorating in various very interesting ways the Guardian's 200th anniversary. Kath became the first female editor of the Guardian in 2015, after long and successful years at the paper, including spells in charge of the Guardian's work in Australia and the USA. Kath is from the north of England. It should be mentioned at the start. Kath, you know about this. Talk us through a bit, for those who don't know, about the foundation of the Guardian in 1821 and its political context. Because the Peterloo Massacre, right in the middle of what's now the city, had happened 2 years before. So it took a little while for it to get started, but the two events are intimately related, aren't they?
Yes, that's right. So John Edward Taylor, who was the founder of the Guardian, the Manchester Guardian, as he launched it, he was in the crowd at Peterloo. He was a reporter for a newspaper that's long forgotten, and he was so shocked by the events, and he was so determined to give voices to the protesters and to tell the truth of what happened that day. And he felt that the rest of the press wasn't really doing it, and he wanted to found a newspaper of his own based on these ideas of reform and getting people representation in Parliament. It took him, I think, about 18 months because he had to get the money together and borrow money from friends, which is what he did. But yeah, he managed to launch it on the 5th of May, 1821, 200 years ago.
Now, Taylor himself said the Guardian was there to zealously enforce the principles of civil and religious liberty. I haven't memorised this. Warmly advocate the cause of reform and endeavour to assist in the diffusion of just principles of political economy. Now that's put in a wording very typical of its time. Can you recognise those principles? I'm not as good as that. Can you recognise those principles in some of them, at least, in what the Guardian still does? Do you think?
I mean, absolutely. I think particularly the principle. There was a founding document, sort of manifesto that the paper launched with. And there's a particular line in it where they spoke about the great diffusion of education that had taken place. Many more people were getting educated, and many poor people were interested in politics. And the job of the Guardian, it said, was to turn that interest to beneficial account. And I found that quite exciting. This idea that people could get facts, get information, but not just for the sake of it, but to try and make the world a better place. I mean, it has to be said, though, quite soon after the launch, there were a few dubious years, if not decades, at the Guardian. And I think it was our editor, C.P. Scott, who took over in 1872, who really made it what it is.
I'll ask you about Scott after this one question. It is interesting, though, notwithstanding that big wobble or somewhat large wobble that you've talked about around that time, the Guardian saw itself at the start as being some sort of beacon of truth and reliability in a world of conjecture and hearsay, right?
Right,
now,
yes.
It's interesting that what goes around comes round in that sense, right? I mean, there are clear parallels there.
That's right. And yes, I mean, I think facts have often been contested, haven't they? And but I think that was, the way I think about it is that the first century of the Guardian was all about saying facts really matter. And the second century was perhaps about building on that with something about morality and values, and that's something perhaps we can talk about with regard to Scott.
Tell me about Scott. But really, first of all, can you introduce Scott really as a contrast to that somewhat wobbly phase that preceded him? He took over in 1872, an interesting time to take over, 2 years after the end of the Franco-Prussian War, 5 years after the first big Reform Act. It was all going off, right? How did he stand in contrast, though, to that slightly questionable period that preceded?
I mean, that would probably explain what the questionable period was. I mean, I think it became a very, very, very profitable paper, which is always suspicious, obviously. No, that was a joke. It became very close to the people who ran the mills in Manchester. It became very close to the powerful and the people who paid for the advertising. And as a result, it infamously supported the American South in the Civil War. And so, sure, lots of people watching will know about the when the cotton workers refused to work with cotton produced in the South and were starving on the streets, but the Guardian sided with the mill owners over the cotton workers. And you could see clearly that we were about to lose our soul. And I think C.P. Scott in 1872 swept all that away, and sort of over many decades, he was editor for 57 years, believe it or not, but he, in that time, made the Guardian what it is today. It's the sort of foundational editor.
But it didn't make him successful or popular in the short term, right? I mean, he had to hold his nerve.
Well, it depends how you define successful or popular. I mean, the most notorious was about the Boer War. So it was this is 1902. There was a very jingoistic period in Britain. I mean, crazy jingoistic from what you can read, really quite extreme. And the Guardian took a stance against the Boer War. And it lost 1/7 of its sales. It lost a whole load of advertising. And a rival newspaper, John, believe it or not, sent a marching band to outside the Cross Street offices, where I've just unveiled a plaque today to celebrate our officers. Unveiled, it's on the Arndale Centre. They sent a marching band to pay a funeral march outside the offices because they were so convinced that the Guardian was about to close. But historians say that was the moment that the Guardian became a paper of the left, most clearly an anti-colonial paper, and sort of, as I say, sort of set us on the track. We were attached to the Liberal Party, but not attached to the party, but attached to liberal ideas, and that's when we really became who we are.
Yeah, it becomes more than liberalism then at that point, right? It has a political edge which goes beyond.
Well, it becomes
Manchester liberalism, so economic liberalism. I mean, some measure of social concern, but probably not enough by modern standards. And Scott definitely takes it further in that direction.
Yeah, Scott was very concerned with social issues. When he took holidays, he was quite disapproving of holidays. But when he took them, he went and sort of did research in poor housing and stuff like that. I mean, he was absolutely committed to investigating poverty, social and political, issues such as that. He very much turned away from the so-called classic liberalism and economic liberalism, and very much turned it to the left.
Manchester, inevitably I'm going to mention this, was dropped from the Guardian's name in 1959, and 5 years later, 1964, its editor and staff moved to London. Is there a certain sadness looking back on that now?
It's interesting. I still meet people fairly often who say, well, of course, it's all been downhill since you dropped the Manchester from your title. So I do think it gave it an outsider status. It gave it a, it said we're not with the establishment. And, if we'd kept the name, and I know that it was, I think the reason they dropped it was because the Guardian, despite having a huge national readership, was classed as a regional paper. And they wanted to be classed as a national paper, which is why the name was dropped. But when you look back, you think, well, no one thinks of the New York Times being just for New York. And I think perhaps it does seem perhaps a shame. But I think I do understand why they made that decision to begin with, because they wanted to be read all around the country and recognised as such.
But sometime after that, you thought seriously about moving it back, right? I mean, that might be a little bit simplistic, but that was something that you took very seriously as a prospect, wasn't it?
That's true, yes. I was very keen on the idea. It was, it was in 2016. We're in considerable financial difficulty, but also I think the Brexit vote had really shone a light on how separate London had become from the rest of the country. And I thought one way to really challenge that would be to move back to Manchester. And I did have some quite serious conversations with people in Manchester about that, yes.
But the point is that did sort of play a role in something else, which is the boosting of the Guardian's presence in Manchester, right? So there is a Guardian presence here to an extent that there wasn't 10 or 15 years ago. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so we've now got a really brilliant team, I think of about 8 or 9, give or take, of really excellent reporters. Some of our best reporters are here, causing a real stir, I think. We've also got now reporters in Birmingham. We've just advertised for somebody in the northeast, and we're just really trying to, I think so much of interest happens outside of London, and I'm keen to recognise that.
But Manchester in particular. It's interesting that happened, and then Andy Burnham arrived as the Metro Mayor. There were various events quite apart from Brexit. I mean, sort of progressive political events, which put Manchester at the centre of things.
Well, that's always been true, though, hasn't it? I mean, that's always been true, that the sort of political and cultural and radical edge has always been in Manchester. So I wouldn't say that was a new point. And perhaps we should have had more people here for a long time.
Last question. In your field of vision, I mean, I don't just mean as the editor of The Guardian, I mean somebody who, has cultural taste and goes out and all that stuff, right? And
I used to go out
and stays in hotels, as we can see. Where does Manchester sit in your field of vision? Because you're from further up north, you're from Ripon originally. But I guess right. was Manchester somewhere you sort of looked to when you were young in some ways?
Yeah, absolutely. For me, it was the shining light on the hill. It was the dream of a future that I might have one day. I mean, it's interesting because I always loved Leeds and Newcastle, which were nearer. But for me, it was Manchester. I used to go twice a year, buy a new winter coat from Affleck's Palace. And, I was obsessed with the Smiths and used to write for Smiths fanzines. And I don't know, it will always have a place for me in my personal psychological life as the sort of a vision of what a good future could be. And I've always found it incredibly exciting as a result, in all its guises, really.
Was that a sort of second-hand, what was called a grandad coat, like a second-hand coat from Affleck's Palace for the winter?
Yeah, old man's coat, yes.
We all had those.
Yeah.
Just to finish,
cycled in and out.
I'm sure. I don't know what happened to mine. Just to finish up, to tell people they can go and see this now, there is a plaque now on Cross Street.
That's right.
On the site of what, the original office, the office where C.P. Scott was? What's it the site of?
Yeah, it's the site where we were for 130 years till 1970. It wasn't our first office. We moved around quite a lot, but it was C.P. Scott's office. So that's the place where all the kind of values, philosophy, identity of The Guardian was forged in those offices. It's now the Arndale Centre. You can see the plaque next to Boots, the side entrance to Boots on Cross Street. And I have to say, it's really beautiful and quite moving, and do go and have a look.
Guardian tourism. See, it's a new direction. Right, thank you for the moment, Kath. That was great. Thank you very much indeed. I am now going to introduce everyone watching. We're over 1,000 now. To our next couple of guests who are going to pop up now. There's Helen. We're just waiting for Mark. There's Mark. Okay, I'll introduce each of our next guests. Helen Pankhurst is the great-granddaughter of Emmeline Pankhurst and the granddaughter of Sylvia Pankhurst, who, as I would imagine everybody watching will know, were both leaders in the suffragette movement and two of Manchester's most famous daughters and activists. Helen herself is a campaigner and an activist for global women's rights, and in 2018 she set up the Centenary Action Group, cross-party coalition of over 100 activists, politicians and women's rights organisations. True to her heritage, so to speak, she's the author of a book called Deeds Not Words, the story of women's rights then and now. And I'm also going to be talking to Mark Fletcher. Mark is the chief executive of Manchester Pride, a charity which campaigns for LGBTQ plus equality. Mark started with the charity in 2004 and 10 years later was appointed as the CEO, and he's led a programme of change which has increased Manchester Pride's profile and positioned the festival as one of the world's most recognisable Pride celebrations. Thank you both for joining us. Helen, I wanted to start with you. Going back to Emmeline and Sylvia Pankhurst, can you talk about the role of Manchester in their sort of shared story? Emmeline was born in Moss Side, I was reminded today. She came of age in a very political city. She was affected by what an industrial city looked like up close. Can you talk to me about the Mancunian aspects of their story?
Yes, I think the Mancunian aspect is really important. They refer to it a lot later on in their lives. So as you mentioned, Moss Side girl was what Emmeline was. Sylvia also brought up in Manchester. In fact, all of the kids born there, I think that's right. And very much part of their history and part of the birthplace, so not just the home, but the birthplace of the suffragette movement in 1903, the Women's Social and Political Union at Nelson Street, which is now both a museum of that period, but also an active women's rights space, the Manchester Manchester Women's Centre and a number of other initiatives there, very much speaking to the reality that women's rights continue to be an issue today.
And specifically Mancunian things, it's interesting that one of Emmeline's formative experiences was seeing sort of industrial poverty close up, right?
Yes, a part of their history. So Richard Pankhurst, Emmeline's husband, a lawyer, very much involved in understanding the social inequalities of the time, known as the radical barrister, and took on a number of social issues, and also stood for and failed to stand for the ILP, the Independent Labour Party. So that history, the radicalism within Manchester at the time, very much feeding into the suffragette movement, the suffrage issues. So not only is the suffragette movement started there, but also Lydia Becker, well before then, starts the national franchise organisation there as well. So the history of franchise, well beyond the suffragette movement, partly born of and in Manchester. And I think for me, what's really interesting is that sense of connection to Manchester that definitely the Pankhurst family had at the time, but the way that is carried on, so that if you go anywhere now, the ownership of the suffragettes and the ownership of the Pankhursts by people from Manchester. So Tony Walsh's famous poem at the Arena bombing in 2017, at that remembrance moment, talking about this is the place, and when he mentions Emmeline, the clapping, the kind of sense of ownership, the fact that when the statue of Emmeline was erected in 2018, 5,000 people came to be there to bring her home. Many other ways in which there is evidence of this mutual, the fact that it was important to them at the time, and it's now owned. The Pankhursts are owned in a way by Manchester.
Mark, there are sort of parallels here between sort of feminism and the struggle for women's rights and so on, with the struggle of gay and lesbian people and the struggle for LGBTQ plus liberation. In the sense that it can't be an accident that it took root in Manchester a long time before it took root in other places. And Manchester was very pioneering in that story. In 1964, Greater Manchester was the birthplace of the campaign for homosexual equality. In the 1980s and 90s, Manchester was central, really, to the campaign against that hateful bit of legislation, Section 28. I remember going on the big national march against Section 28 in 1986 down Oxford Road. So Helen's put the Pankhurst and the struggle for women's rights in the context of Manchester as a sort of cutting-edge industrial city.
Yeah. When
it comes to the struggle for gay rights, why Manchester, do you think?
You know what? I've been making note of a few words when Helen was talking, and just throughout your questioning, and I've put a number of words that you've said a number of times: radical, pioneering, progressive, and one word that I added to that myself was passion and passionate, and it's because of the people of the city. I think, the similarities that are drawn there is because Manchester is steeped in heritage. For people who want to stand for what's right. We are a progressive city of individuals who come together to collectively to pioneer what we believe in. And that, some of the instances that you've mentioned over the years, not least that you said you were at the Section 28 rally, which is pretty, well, that's quite formidable, that you were there. In opposition to that piece of legislation, the first piece of anti-LGBT plus legislation in 100 years at the time. It's the people. I think it's in Manchester, coming from this industrious past, there's a sense of togetherness, and together we want to achieve change. Manchester celebrates its diversity more than any city that I've travelled to around the world, and certainly within the UK. And that's something that I'm proud to be a part of. I think it's all down to the passion of the people, and we're really proud to celebrate our differences here. It's quite unique. I can't pinpoint it. If I could put it in a bottle, I'd share it with cities around the world. I really would. But I can't quite pinpoint on it. There's something in the air. Let's say that.
Yeah. Now, talking of which, you grew up in Sale, which is sort of the South Mancunian suburbs, right? I wonder, sort of gay life in Manchester, in the city centre, how that appeared to you, sort of for the first time. Can you remember your sort of formative experience of the city itself, and some of the things we've talked about?
Yeah, I can. I mean, I'm much younger than you, John, so I was sadly not at the rally. I wasn't of age at that time. But yeah, I can remember my formative years, but I've got to be honest with you. I was a late bloomer. I didn't, I wasn't comfortable. I didn't recognise who I was, and didn't come to the point of coming out until I was much later in age, in my 20s, by which time I was already working or supporting the work of the charity that I now lead, Manchester Pride. What I do remember is where I lived. Yeah, I grew up in quite Sale was a great suburb of Greater Manchester, but I grew up on quite a impoverished council estate in that part of the world. My world was very different to how it was in city centre Manchester. For me, I remember the openings of Manto, which was the first gay bar that became very famous and well renowned on Canal Street. For opening up with these huge glass windows on Canal Street, so the world could see who was inside. After years of oppression, having to hide in pubs such as the Union, it was a celebration of being who you were and not being ashamed, and the world recognising that. I kind of grew up in what I deem the queer as folk era, the glamorisation of Manchester's gay village through Russell T Davies' depiction in that world-famous TV series. And for me, I've got to say, Manchester city centre was like that at that time, and if you're an LGBTQ plus person, it was a new world that was being opened up then. It was far cry from what you were experiencing in the pubs on the council estate from where I would live, where I was living at the time. But it inspired you, and it gave you that hope that there was a sense of belonging and being. I recently employed somebody who told me that one of the reasons they moved to the city from where they lived in Canada because of Manchester Pride, and in the past I had other team members saying it because of what they see in Unqueer as folk. So we know that this inspired people to be who they are, and I think it's still that way today.
You cut out a bit there. They moved from Canada to Manchester.
Yeah, I've had a couple of people on my team moving from Canada to Manchester, yeah.
Oh, okay. What an amazing thing. Helen, Mark mentioned television a moment ago. I'm going to mention Coronation Street now, because it has to be mentioned at some stage, I suppose. I have a friend who has a theory that Manchester, to some extent, is a matriarchal society, that the presence of strong women is very sort of visible in the way that Manchester works and people's attitudes and so on. And his proof for that is Coronation Street, which at the time was the first soap opera with an abundance of strong female characters. I noticed that the Pankhurst Trust has been involved in a recent podcast called Strong Manchester Women. I mean, you yourself are at this end of a dynasty of strong Manchester women. Do you think there's something to that idea? Maybe it's to do with being futuristic, so women are able to be strong. But there's something there.
I mean, I love it, and I hope social media can pick this up and we can see what people think. We need one of those votes to see what the 1,000+ people listening feel about it. I mean, definitely there is a history of very strong women, but one of the things I'm involved in is a coalition which I've convened called GM for Women. So that's GM and the number 4 women. 2028, and we're working from the period 2018 to 2028 to see what the situation is like for women and girls, and to literally see what in Greater Manchester, what can we say politically, in terms of economically, in terms of issues of violence against women, in terms of cultural factors, in terms of safety, so education. And the reality is that we still have major inequality in Manchester. So maybe, yes, there is this idea of matriarchy, but a scorecard, which is what we've been using, there's actually this, we're calling it the Fawcett-Pankhurst or Pankhurst-Fawcett scorecard, is showing us that we're not seeing improvements year in, year out. So between 2018 and now, a lot of the data is actually showing things not getting better, and with COVID, the gender inequality actually on a number of spheres seems to be going back. So I think my view would be, yes, there are strong women, but structurally we still have in Manchester as elsewhere great inequality. And I think that Manchester, because it owns this idea about radicalism and in particular feminism, wants to present itself and can present itself in a different way. So that's what I want to be involved in, and I think anybody else who is interested in that, please join this coalition. The universities are very much involved in trying to look at the research and data, the data-driven change. If the data is showing us that we still have inequality, then we can campaign on that. But there's a lot more to be done.
Right, so that's the key phrase here. There's a lot more to be done. Mark, you're nodding away. After that very long and proud pun excused, I'm sure, Mancunian LGBTQ plus history, it'd be easy to think of Pride as a sort of purely celebratory event. It's just part of the life of the city now, and that's that. And obviously it's changed, police officers that go on the Pride procession and all the rest of it, but it's still a political event with a small p, and more to the point, there's still work to be done, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is. And, our most political event is the parade itself. That is a march for LGBT plus equality. There's a lot of work to be done. And, this is why, I am a proud Mancunian. I'm proud to say that the city continues to be radical in its approach to celebrating differences and campaigning for greater equality. We know we're not there yet. I'm proud at the moment to be the chair of the LGBT plus advisory group, which was established by the newly re-elected Greater Manchester Mayor Andy Burnham back in 2019, and we've established a panel of individuals to recognise and address the inequalities faced by LGBT plus people throughout the region. Again, another UK first here in Manchester. And this gives LGBT plus people a number of seats at a table that can influence policy and strategy in the delivery of public services, recognising specific issues faced by LGBT plus people. And it's this type of dynamism that makes me proud to be Mancunian, but it's testament to the fact that there's a lot of work still to be done for us to gain true equality and inclusion.
Right. We'll talk probably at the end when there are questions, or towards the end when there are questions from the people here about what that means in practice. Thank you so much to Mark and Helen. You're going to come back after this. We are now going to move on Might be finally getting into my stride here. We are going to move on to Tim Burgess and Henrietta Smith-Rolla, aka Afrodeutscher. Thank you both for joining us tonight.
Hi.
I'm sort of inwardly amazed that it's all working smoothly, but I don't want to tempt fate. Let me introduce you both. This is the sort of musical part of the evening, about not just Manchester's rich musical past, but its musical future as well. First of all, Tim Burgess, who probably doesn't need any introduction, particularly not after the last year. But I will introduce Tim anyway. I followed Tim's career since I reviewed his band's first album for Sounds magazine, a defunct music weekly, when I was 20 years old, and he wasn't much older. That band, of course, is the Charlatans. It were a byword. I mean, they long outlasted this, but initially they were a byword for the so-called Manchester period, and the Charlatans are now celebrating their 31st birthday, which I know was meant to be your 30th birthday celebration, but the pandemic got in the way. Tim is a record label owner, a champion of rights for musicians, and in the last year, as well as working to save music venues, which are in Manchester, which I'll ask you about in a moment, Tim, has hosted Twitter listening parties, which is what got us, a lot of us, through the sort of darker, more depressing evenings of the pandemic. I speak from experience here. In the first lockdown, if they hadn't been going, I would have been a much more miserable person. Next to him, virtually speaking, is Henrietta Smith-Rolla. Henrietta is a composer, producer, and DJ who goes with the stage name of Afrodeutscher. She may have been born in London and raised in Devon, but she has adopted Manchester as her spiritual home. The paper I work for, The Guardian, has described Afrodeutscher Henrietta as, quote, the beloved face in the UK underground. She's going to talk to us about the Manchester music scene today and why she loves the city. And I'm glad that's the last thing on my notes, because that's the first question I want to ask you, Henrietta. Why do you love Manchester?
So many reasons. But I think, I basically moved to Manchester in 2005, but I was dating a guy who was from Manchester from like 2000, 2001. I basically fell in love with a jazz musician who lived in Manchester. And I kept on coming to Manchester from London on the train, and I would cry on my way home back to London, because I just wanted to stay. And eventually, after about 3 years, I decided to move. And there was something innate about Manchester that I fell in love with. I'd get off the train at Piccadilly and I'd walk through town, and I'd go to Matt and Fred's and I'd sit there and watch him play, and I would meet people at the bar, and I'm still friends with people who used to work behind the bar there now, and eat pizza, and just it was a welcoming city. Moving from Devon and from a really small town, everyone knew who you were, and you could smile at people and not be rejected. And it was a big shock for me moving to London and smiling at people on the underground and people looking at me like I was crazy. So it was kind of like this switch that I felt when I went to Manchester. It was this place where I could smile at people on the street and they would respond with a nod or a smile back. And that's sort of what started that love.
Were you aware at that stage, I'm sure you were, because I think you can hear it in your music, of the sort of heritage, a horrible word, but the lineage is probably a better word, of electronic music and clubbing and what had happened in Manchester in the sort of late 80s and early 90s? Because your music runs a lot more widely than that, but nonetheless, there are frequent moments when I can hear the sort of ghosts of that kind of music. More to the point, actually, the music Manchester adopted, really, from Chicago and Detroit. So were you aware of that as a Mancunian thing when you decided to live there?
Initially, when I moved to Manchester, no. I was listening to jazz. I was going to jazz clubs. But it was when actually Graham Massey approached me at a gig, a friend's gig, and he said he was putting together a band and he wanted me to play in this band. And at the time, I didn't know how to play keys. I didn't know how to play anything. I knew that I loved music and I knew that I could, but I didn't know how to play anything. And so I just said yes, because I thought, well, why not? And Manchester at that point for me was such a welcoming place that I just had the freedom to say yes. And so I joined this band, and we were called Sisters of Transistors. And we played organs and synths, and Graham drummed. And it was just this introduction to his world and his heritage, if you like, and his way of thinking. And that's when I first sort of really latched on to that idea that you know, Manchester was filled with so many different styles of music. It wasn't just this electronic thing. But of course, having listened to and grown up with Top of the Pops, you know, I'd seen Graham on Top of the Pops and I'd loved it. But
we should make it clear that Graham is one of the founder members and remains the sort of prime mover in 808 State, who are a byword, really, for Manchester and electronic music. And interestingly, Graham has, I think, very believable theories about how Manchester's appetite for electronic music goes way back into its industrial past, right? So it's part of this long history that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think it's really important to mention that I think, you know, with electronic music, and especially in sort of late 80s and early 90s with Manchester and Chicago and Detroit, people were using the same gear, same equipment, Roland, 808, 303, 77, this whole thing. So it was almost like, you know, from working class backgrounds, all not classically trained, you know, learning how to use this gear and producing this music that was, I think it was speaking of the time, if you like. It was what was going on for both, you know, cultures in Manchester and in Detroit and in Chicago.
Tim, let's bring you in now, because that's a period you will recall very vividly. You were sort of in the midst of it all as a punter to start with, and as a musician. You were born in Salford, but you grew up in Cheshire, sort of prohibitively far from the city to make it easy coming in and out, although you did it, which I'll ask you about in a minute. I was amazed to read that one of your formative Mancunian experiences was going on a school trip to the legendary Hacienda. A teacher took you on a school trip to the Hacienda.
I know, that's it's still kind of quite hard to believe, but you know, I have recollections of sort of like running through the plastic sort of doorway, you know, the second door, after the brilliant picture of Tony that I didn't really see that, but I remember the plastic, and then running around, and then I remember my friend Matthew Gurney getting back on the bus, and that's pretty much all I remember. It's quite uneventful, but you know, it's a great tale, you know, and a great first memory.
But a seed was planted in your mind about maybe the idea of Manchester as represented by Tony and Factory Records, right?
Well, yeah, because this must have been maybe 82, probably, and I didn't really start following New Order until probably 83, you know, with Blue Monday and Confusion, but I mean, obviously Tony was ever present, being a reporter on Granada Reports, and always thought he was an interesting guy. I think the connection with him and the Hacienda and New Order made him extremely interesting, and he was almost like the frontman in a lot of ways. Yeah.
The other thing I read, which I was amazed by, I mean, I'll fess up now, we're about half an hour in. I was born in Manchester, but I grew up in Wilmslow, which is quite across the Bear, really. But, you know, I'm all right with it now. Now, you were sort of quite close to Northwich, which is deeper into Cheshire, right?
Yeah.
But I was amazed to read that you would go to the Hacienda regularly, and then the club would close at 2 a.m. You would then walk to Altrincham. Anyone who's familiar with Mancunian geography will know that this is mind-boggling. You would then walk to Altrincham and get like the milk train on that train line that goes through Knutsford and stuff, and make your way back to Cheshire. So when you were going out for about 18 hours at a time.
Yeah,
I mean that's dedication.
Well, it is, and it, you know, it was never planned that we would walk home. It was always planned we'd find somewhere to stay, and you know, we were kind of like, you know, anytime really, I suppose from like 17, you know, 17, 18, 19, you know, you're feeling pretty good, you know, and you think that you've got chances of meeting somebody and finding friends that might let you stay there, you know, real Manchester people, you know, because I was, you know, walking, you know, I was, you know, Northwich. I mean, I was born in Greater Manchester, but, you know, coming from Northwich, it was just like this beautiful, like paradise, really. I mean, I used to go as a teenager, buy punk clothes and punk records and things like that, but you know, to go meeting people at this amazing club, you know, it's like 17, 18, it's just an amazing thing. So we thought we'd meet people, but occasionally we'd walk home. most of the time we got a train from Altrincham.
But it was worth it.
The whole thing. It was such. The hardest bit was Northwich to a village called Malton, which is actually 4 miles from Northwich. So I was deep into suburbia, you know.
It was worth it, though, wasn't it? I mean, I don't want to sound like a couple of old gits here, but you know, the Hacienda experience was worth it. I mean, I'd have walked 12 miles to go to the Hacienda ring.
Exactly, because I mean, on a Thursday night, you know, Dave Haslam would DJ. On Friday and Saturday, it was Acid House, Chicago House. You know, there's, you know, I saw New Order there about 4 or 5 times. They could play G-Mex, but they always played the Hacienda, you know.
Henrietta and Tim, I'm sure you'll have something to say about this as well. Manchester then was a city of cheap property, lots of empty space, and actually, its music and its culture were the spark for regeneration. I mean, that was almost Tony Wilson's plan, right? Was you use music and culture to begin to turn the city around, and it came true. But Manchester's quite a different place now. I once asked Richard Leese, the leader of the city council, this, and unprompted, he quoted the Smiths lyric, "In the days when you were hopelessly poor, I just liked you more." Now, he disagreed with that. But there is this idea that perhaps Manchester is a much harder place for musicians to live now because it's upmarket and the city centre is expensive and so on. And therefore, it isn't perhaps quite as welcoming for musicians as it once was. Henrietta, is it easy being a musician in modern Manchester?
I don't think it's easy to be a musician anywhere. I don't think it's easy to be a musician. I think, you know, when I moved to Manchester, what I loved was the community, and how I was welcomed into this community so quickly, you know. And when I say community, it meant that there were people who were in so many different styles of music and in so many different ways, accomplished in so many different ways, but would share the wealth of their knowledge and their experience. So, you know, when I first started playing live with a band called Silver Club, when I had gear that was broken, I could lean on friends and borrow a mixer off them, or borrow a microphone, or, you know, a power supply for this random synth that I'd been lent by someone else. And so that sort of level of community has been really important, and that's made it easier to be a musician in Manchester, because it's tough.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. It's interesting, again, I mean, to keep mentioning Tony Wilson. Wilson said Manchester was, did he say, Tim will know this, it was big enough to be a city, but for musicians it had the feel of a village.
Yeah.
Now, that's a little bit over-romanticised, but I quite like that as an idea.
Yeah, I like that too.
Yeah, definitely.
Tim, talking of the sort of creative health of that village, just as we draw to a close, just tell me about the last year, and we all know about the listening parties, and if you don't, you should look them up. But you've been quite involved in saving 2 key Manchester music venues, the Deaf Institute and Gorilla. Just tell me a bit about A, how you did it, and B, why it was important.
Gorilla and Deaf Institute said that they were closing, and I was talking to Aaron from Tokyo Industries, and he was very keen to save them, and I asked if I could come on board, which I did.
And having done that, and I'll ask Henrietta this as well, looking ahead, I know the Charlatans have got a big gig in Manchester, which is forthcoming, right, as part of your 31st celebration.
Yeah, Victoria Warehouse.
What are you feeling as a musician looking ahead to maybe the rest of this year and into 2022? Tim first, and then I'll ask that question to Henrietta.
About playing live, you mean? Or
playing live, and also you've been involved in this as well, the fact that this question about what musicians earn from streaming and so on has become foregrounded. It's a difficult time for musicians.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, you know, the last year, I think everyone just felt terrible about not being able to play live, and you know, and then sort of like just realizing, well, you know, trying to find out where they could make money, you know, really, and so, I mean, I think there's real positives now, you know, moving forward, and I think everyone's like so desperate to go and see live music again that it'll just, you know, I mean, it'll just be completely celebratory, you know. That's
Henrietta,
right.
Yeah, you can sort of start to feel it's become quite tantalising now.
Yes, I really think so. I mean, I was going to say that it's going to be a huge celebration at the Charlatans gig, but I mean, it's going to be a huge celebration as soon as any door opens, you know.
Yeah. To mix sort of celebration with relief, the sheer fact of being able to do it again.
I think so. Yeah.
Henrietta, have you got any? So do you know when you're going to return to performing in some capacity in front of an audience again? Have you got dates booked in?
Yeah, I actually had a very interesting conversation with my manager this afternoon about upcoming shows, and it was really odd to be discussing it, to be talking about it, and sort of that anticipation of it. And to be honest, I'm terrified. I'm petrified because, you know, there's so much that goes into playing live and DJing, and it's just having been alone for so long. And I actually contracted COVID back in March 2020, and I had long COVID and really struggled with that. And so through all of that, I've learned a lot, but also lost the, I feel like I've lost the understanding of what playing live is. You know, I have it in my heart, but when I think about it, I'm filled with fear, and I'm not sure where that comes from. And I just wonder if that's from a pandemic. You know, it's just it's the unknown, you know, and this pressure of, you know, this will be a celebration, but, you know, I'll be battling with my own fears when it happens. So I'm mixed about it because it is so involved, and it's so important to so many people because we need music to live, to exist. We need it, and you know, with isolation and those kind of things, it's like Tim said, it's going to be a celebration when the doors open. It's going to be a huge celebration, and imagine being on the other side of that. You're delivering the celebration. No pressure.
You'll be fine. You'll be fine. Right. On that note, obviously, both of you are going to come back in as we take questions from the floor. Thank you so much. I'm now going to introduce everybody to Andy Burnham. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Henrietta. Andy, are you there?
I'm here somewhere, John. Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear. It's nice to see you. How are you?
Yeah, good, thanks. Yeah. Not been a bad few days, so I'm tired but pretty happy.
There you are. I'm going to ask you a bit about your backstory to start with. Like Tim Burgess, like me, you were brought up beyond the city limits, beyond Manchester city limits. I was reading today that you went to school in Culture, which I looked on Google Maps, and I was reminded is almost exactly halfway between Manchester and Liverpool. Like you could put a pin halfway, right? What did Manchester represent to you growing up as somewhere that was sort of there, but it was maybe in the middle distance? And I mean that culturally more than politically. Because we've had these conversations before. There are certain Labour politicians I couldn't ask that question to, but I'm sure you'll have them.
So I went to school in Newley Willows, just for a point of accuracy. But you're right.
Sorry.
I was born in Liverpool. My dad gets a job in Manchester when I was 1, and as being born of 2 Scousers, they didn't want to go all the way to Manchester, so they went halfway. That's basically what happened. And to be honest, I was the only one in the family that really started to lean towards Manchester. I spent a lot of time with my dad in Manchester when he was working there. We went to watch the cricket a lot, and I was in and around Manchester mainly in my youth. And what did it mean to me? Although we probably think a bit differently about him now, Morrissey sort of said something somehow that we could be better than we were seen, if you know what I mean. We could be better than we kind of were viewed, and why shouldn't we be sort of, aiming big and, making things happen. So I don't know, I kind of got swept up into that, to be honest, in that, that time really of, kind of seeing these, not just him, but, all of the bands of that time sort of speaking to a sentiment that, we can be better than this, and we don't accept second best, and, aim a bit higher. And I don't know if that makes sense to you, but that's very much what it meant to me culturally.
Yeah. It's that famous bit at the Stone Roses Blackpool Live when Ian Brown comes on stage and he shouts, international. And what he means is this isn't just Manchester anymore. No, I think he means this is international. I think he means that
there
this
was a
isn't
club that they played at called the International, wasn't there, which I used to go to. But I was at that gig, and that's what I mean when I say that. I felt we were swept up in something, that we've been a bit, I don't know, the 80s have been bad, and, we were meant to feel all bad about everything, but all of a sudden there was this thing that you kind of said, well, actually, don't feel like that. You can be the place to be. And it felt like we were honestly, I consider myself so lucky, John, that, I was kind of in the city in that period, the late 80s. Those were my late teenage years. And it felt like it was the centre of the universe.
It's amazing.
And it was the centre of the universe, actually, for anybody who was there at the time. And, it did something. I think it did something in terms of me, really, in terms of your sense of confidence, your identity, all of that got reinforced by what was happening in the city at that time.
I'm very impressed you were at Blackpool Empress Ballroom. Did you go to Spike Island?
I just dropped that in there. No, my younger brother went there, and I was already thinking they were going a bit mainstream by then. But I was related to something that Tim Burgess said before, because I went to see the Smiths at Salford University on the Queen is Dead tour. I'm getting all of my...
I was at that gig as well. Now, and Johnny Marr says that's the best gig the Smiths ever played. So again, we're very fortunate to have been there for that.
But somebody reminded me recently that Morrissey came on for the encore and said, "You've missed the last bus." I remember him saying that. And that was always life, seeing gigs in Manchester, wasn't it? Panicking about getting home. I mean, I could never get the milk train. I would have never, my mum and dad would not have allowed behaviour of that kind. So, those experiences were just massive, weren't they, for people there. Mike Joyce told me, actually, that was the last gig at the Maxwell Hall, because hundreds of thousands of pounds of damage was done to it, because the place was literally bouncing on its foundations.
There are still struts, like big metal things, tools almost, that are put in place to hold up the window frames, still there to this day, that you can see from the structural damage from that concert. That was your fault, Andy Burnham. Now,
I apologise to Salford University already.
Moving ahead from the summer of 1986 to when you became the mayor of Greater Manchester, certainly in the build-up to doing that, when you were making that switch from Westminster politics to Greater Manchester and its politics, people in certainly Manchester City, I don't mean the football team, but Manchester City Council, had achieved miracles and amazing transformation in that time. Did you feel a certain trepidation that there were things you had to learn? You were dealing with people who were very, very experienced in non-London politics, and perhaps you weren't.
No, I was in awe, I'll be honest, of Howard and Richard in terms of what they'd done. Because bear in mind, I'd come in 2001 as a Greater Manchester MP, albeit for Lee, which Graham Stringer once famously called a muddy field down the East Lancs. So we were not in the metropolitan set, obviously. But I was very much involved. And as I became a minister, Howard and Richard, were in touch with me a lot, basically. And
Howard Bernstein, just make this clear, it's Howard Bernstein, the famous former chief executive of Manchester City Council, and Richard Lee's the leader of the council. Sorry, carry on.
And in some ways, they spoke to that thing I was talking about before about we can be better than this. The ambition that they constantly were putting to the government, and actually the government that I was in not always responding properly to that ambition that they both had. And I unfortunately was tasked by Gordon Brown with turning down the casino. That was day one, and my job as culture secretary dispatched to the Commons to make that particular statement. I happen to think it was the right decision, in my view, in retrospect, but not everybody, certainly Howard and Richard didn't think it was the right decision at the time. So I had my positive dealings, but also challenging dealings. But I was kind of in awe of what they'd achieved, really, and because I kind of saw, in my time as the Greater Manchester MP, the place just sort of moving ahead of everywhere else.
Since then, you've changed, haven't you? And I don't mean that in a sort of cosmetic, opportunistic way. I mean, this is the experience of being the mayor of Greater Manchester has made you a different sort of politician and possibly a different person. That's true, isn't it?
I think I was changing before I left Westminster. So obviously the experience of working on Hillsborough did that. I kind of did make a personal break there at that point. I couldn't anymore be the minister in the suit, sort of standing. I knew that I was running my course with Westminster, and I guess then through the 2015 leadership election, the strong sense came over that, if you spend a long time in that world, I think you lose a sense of who you are and what you're about, because you're told to vote in certain ways, say certain things that you may not actually believe in. And I suppose I was on a bit of a process out. By that time I'd fallen out of love with what I was doing down there. And I then saw this as probably the thing that spoke most to me and what I've always been about. And so I have changed in that I guess people see the real me really in this job. I'm liberated, I'm energized, I'm passionate about everything that we're doing. And it goes to the core of why I started in the first place. If anything, John, motivated me in the first place, it was that, going from Greater Manchester to Cambridge University, just thinking, hang on a minute, we're two worlds here. There's two worlds going on in this country. And there's one thing here for people here, and there's quite, and that has always been the thing that's motivated me. And when I got to Westminster, I kind of realised that actually the world that wasn't Greater Manchester was running the show down there. And, increasingly I got frustrated with kind of trying to change that. And in this role now, finally, I feel I am making more headway than I could do in Westminster.
Is it still a frustration? I mean, perhaps as regards the Labour Party specifically, I think you mentioned this over the weekend, that perhaps despite what you've achieved there and the fact that there are all sorts of amazing things going on in Greater Manchester, that perhaps the people in charge of the Labour Party don't quite understand how relevant that is, and that perhaps people in your position should be listened to.
Yeah, it is to a degree. Labour is London-centric. I'll keep saying that, and I'll say it until it changes. And it pains me that, it's the government that's talking about levelling up, whereas that should have been, Labour did level up to a degree with things that happened when we were in government, Media City, and, you can look at the Commonwealth Games and the aftermath of the Commonwealth Games, but it was not enough. And I just think there's always, I always felt in my time, certainly in Westminster politics, that life here and the perspective of people is just not understood by people at the top of both of the political parties and people in the civil service. And there's only so long you can bang your head against the brick walls in that system and not get fed up with it and try and do something else. And I'm now doing the something else. But actually, I think the something else, the evolution, is the future of English politics.
Now, not in Manchester and Greater Manchester, and not in Liverpool, not in Bristol so much perhaps, but in large swathes of the country, the Labour Party's in a mess at the moment, right? I think you probably agree with that.
It's a bit of a mixed picture, but yeah, I mean, in terms of what happened in the northeast, that was pretty catastrophic, really.
Okay, and then sort of the last question really of this section. I just wonder, given that of votes cast, you got over 70% last Thursday. That's right, isn't it? I think
67. 67.
Okay, close to 70%. And we both know that there are Labour councils in Salford and Preston and Wigan which didn't lose seats. I think in Salford they put them on, right? What does the Labour Party, or what can the Labour Party learn, do you think, from the Greater Manchester experience at this time when it's really thinking about these existential questions?
It's about truly building from the bottom up. Labour has been a centralising sort of party, really. That's where its instincts have always been. It's kind of distrusted localism, but that's then in the end becomes almost distrusting the places where, or it seems to distrust the places where its support comes from. And what Labour can learn is, if you kind of create a different kind of politics that comes from the bottom up, strong, authentic representation, much more focused on the issue. So I don't know if you saw yesterday, John, I took a journey from Middleton to Media City, kind of showed people the reality of what it is to travel on public transport here. I just honestly don't think that's fully understood by MPs of all parties, but including MPs of my own party. And I think it is about getting down to that kind of level and, being bold about things. I in all of my time in Labour politics, they got so cautious about everything. Everything had to be nuanced and worrying about the money and what will the Daily Mail say and all that kind of stuff. You've just got to paint in primary colours, I think. You've got to do opposition in primary colours, bold strokes on things that matter to people, and speak in a way that is just, real, I guess. And I think devolution allows that. I think it allows the people who are doing it to sort of recreate politics outside of the sort of stultifying structures of Westminster.
Final question. Maybe 2 more powers that you haven't got, which the Greater Manchester Combined Authority hasn't got, which if this is going to really work, would make it sort of fly even higher. And notwithstanding the fact that, as we know, this government is highly unlikely to hand you these powers, but nonetheless, what would you like that you haven't got?
Well, I definitely would like control of rail, because I said yesterday we're going to integrate bus and tram in a London-style system. I think that's a game changer for Greater Manchester. Honestly, I do, John. When people can take as many buses and trams on any given day and only pay up to a cap, that is a big, big change for us. But then if you add rail into that mix and you devolve commuter rail services and stations into it, then I'm calling it the B network, yellow and black, all under public control. That changes this city region for the better. It changes people's lives for the better. The other one I would point to would be control of skills. One thing this country has never, ever, ever done properly from a national level is technical education. And that's because within Westminster, everyone has been to university and they're all obsessed with the university route. And this is another example of one of those issues that Labour also gets obsessed about, all of the university educated people in Labour, and they never come up with convincing solutions on technical education. I believe we need in this city region control of post-16 education so that we can make sure that we're bringing the talent out of our 10 boroughs into this amazing place that is Greater Manchester today, because it is an amazing place, isn't it? But I believe that, and I believe I'm in the best job in the world, in the best city region in the world, John. I wouldn't be anywhere else. I ain't going back to Westminster anytime soon, and I'm really made up to be re-elected with this mandate. I
was going to say as well, with Gavin Williamson in charge, I'd quite like you to take control of pre-16 education as well, but that's another story. Right. I know, Andy, you've got to go at 6:15, so we can now bring in everybody else who's been participating tonight, and we can take some questions which we can throw around. Welcome back, everybody. Glad you're still here. This is Andy Burnham, newly elected Mayor of Greater Manchester.
Hey, Andy.
Now, we've had some questions which are coming in on my little sidebar here, but there are some great questions which have been sent in advance, which I'm just trying to find. Some of which are quite good fun. Right, so let's just throw this around. Keep your answers short, but I'd like to hear from everybody. Erica Fabe asks all the panel, what's your favourite place to eat in Manchester? Your favourite record shop and your favourite place to go and see live music? Just pitch in with any or all of those. Where's the best place to eat in Manchester right now?
Aldecott.
Restaurant. I went there today. That's good that you said that.
Can you tell us a bit more about
breakfast? Very good. I like V-Reg. Is that what it's called? The vegan place, the vegan burger place.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good. Tim?
But Greens is also great, yeah.
I think I know that record shop. Go on, tell me that one. I'll ask you about the favourite record shop.
Oh, Eighth Day.
Okay.
To eat food.
Okay.
Record shop, Piccadilly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's always been Piccadilly.
I love Piccadilly Records. I've been going there. I mean, it's changed locations a few times, but it's just an amazing record shop, and they do what they do best. Yeah.
Live music. I mean, it's a strange question to ask at the minute, but live music venue.
Albert Hall.
Who said Albert? Henrietta.
I'd like to mention a record shop, Eastern Bloc in the Northern.
I knew you were going to say that, Henrietta. I was thinking you'd be more Eastern Bloc than Piccadilly Records. It's like City versus United, isn't it? Are you Eastern Bloc or are you Piccadilly Records? I knew you'd be.
You like guitar music.
I'm going to nail your question, John. The best is Brewdog, then into Rudy's Pizza, then up into the Albert Hall. That's the best night out in Manchester.
Okay, now you know where to find Andy Burnham if you want to give him any hassle about anything.
I'm going to put a plug in for the Ethiopian restaurants and all the diversity of foods in Manchester.
Very good. I'm going to give a plug to British Tea Power, which is my favourite cafe in the world near Affleck's. If you get the grilled cheese sandwich, you can't walk for about 3 hours after you're eating it, but it's really nice. Now, Andy, a question specifically from you, from Wendy. What is it about being the mayor of Manchester, Greater Manchester, that made you become so comfortable in your own skin? That's a difficult question.
Well, thank you that you think I like the fact that you think I am. I just am. I'm in my element. I'm in my natural habitat, and that was never what Westminster was to me. And I'm sort of connecting with all of my passions, really. So, yeah, I mean, it's the best job in the world. I just said that to you, John, but I absolutely mean that. And I'm so lucky, really, genuinely. But I think if you're doing something that you are, passionate about with people that you love in a place that you know, then you're always going to be okay, aren't you?
I hope so. Now, Nilufer Ertan is watching us from Istanbul. She's got a specific question for you, Kath. It says, how many women editors in chief has the British press had up till now, and what's been the role of women journalists in the Guardian?
Yes, so I'm the editor-in-chief of the Guardian, but there's been lots of great women. There's a fantastic woman, Georgina Henry, who was deputy editor for many years. And in fact, the first woman editor-in-chief of a British newspaper was Rachel Beer, who did the Sunday Times and the Observer at the same time. I think it was at the turn of the century. So she was a high achiever. I mean, her husband owned them both, so it was perhaps a different kind of era. But she was still a strong and powerful editor. I think since when I got my job, there weren't many, but since then there are now quite a few more. So the editor of the Financial Times is a woman, the editor of the Sunday Times is a woman, and the Mirror and the Sun.
And the Evening Standard, where Andy now has a weekly column, I was amazed to learn today.
Yeah, the London paper. Andy, what's that all about?
I don't know. They asked me, and I was a bit amazed to be asked. But I don't want them to think that we're all just whinging away up here. And I don't want them to start blocking levelling up. I want London to buy into levelling up. I want them to understand why we are saying some of the things that we're saying. Do you know what I mean? Because I don't think it's going to help anybody if London, the South Pole, Manchester, the North Pole. We need to sort of have a bit of an understanding with each other, I think, and that's why it seemed a good offer to
with that.
Win friends and influence people for Greater Manchester's ambitions.
Okay, now another fun question. Everybody, throw in some names. What would be your ideal dinner party comprised of only Mancunians? Now, in honour of some people here tonight, we'll say people who are adopted Mancunians or feel an affinity with the city, people associated. But nonetheless, a dinner party full of Mancunians and Manchester associated people. Who would you invite? Anybody.
I'm going for the Ethiopia theme because that's part of my background, and I would want to have a meal with Lemsisai very promptly.
Good answer.
I mean, isn't Carol Ann Duffy from Manchester as well? And Linda Sterling?
Good answer. She'd bring Morrissey, though. That might make things problematic.
Yeah.
Johnny Marr, I think, would be more fun.
Yeah.
Tim, you'd invite Johnny, would you?
I think Stephen Morris. I mean, I love Johnny, but I think Stephen Morris and Marcus Rashford probably.
Marcus Rashford, yes.
The person I could have just wished to have, would be Caroline Ahern. Would have been absolute dream person to have a night out with. I never met her. I wish I had. But
I've had a night out with Caroline.
In the back of the Financial. Have you? So pause there. You had a night out with Caroline Ahern.
Yeah. At the Red Cafe in Manchester. Mid-90s. So much fun.
I was once at a party where Caroline Ahern was there, and she asked me to hold a drink and say, "Hey, Caroline," in a loud voice. So Mick Hucknall would and realise it was her. And that's it.
Oh my God. Wow,
it didn't work. Now, if we widen it a bit into Mancunians not just alive, but if you go back in history, you'd have a fascinating dinner party because Marx and Engels could come. I mean, that's the other thing we forget. Alan Turing. I mean, and that's sort of a serious point, which tells you about the rich history of the place.
All the scientists, many of them.
Yeah, it does. He's again an LGBT plus pioneer of the city. Yeah, he's somebody I'd love to have a conversation with over dinner.
Brilliant. Now, Simon Donahue asks, is there any such thing as Manchester music today, or are there a lot of music of different types that happen to be made in Manchester? Arguably, it's broader and more diverse. That's a Tim and Henrietta question.
It's extremely diverse. It always has been. I think it's a place of freedom when it comes to music, Manchester. It's like you can try anything here. And I think, there were endless promoters with endless musical genres and music happening in Manchester before the pandemic, and endless creators, just loads.
Latterly, Tim, because I know you're involved, I mean, even as far as festivals are concerned, you're very active in keeping your hand in, and staying aware of new stuff and the cutting edge and so on. Just in the last sort of 5 or 10 years, interesting things that have come out of Manchester musically, what sort of things would you mention?
I've just booked a band called Red Stains for Tim Peaks. It's a festival I do within a festival at Kendal Calling. We've had Cabbage play, we've had Blossoms play, all before they kind of like took off, really, and they're all kind of, pretty decent sized Manchester bands. Well, quite big now. But I think, it's just endless, isn't it? It's always going to be, there's always something going to be happening. Creating something out of nothing. That's what we do.
Joe Faulkner asks everybody, is Manchester really the soul of the UK? I don't know what you would understand by that, but Andy, you seem to at least slightly nod there. Is there something about it which sort of tells you about the country as a whole?
I think so. I was saying this with Kath this morning, on the theme of the day, 200 years of the Guardian. It's always been the city has always stood up for the underdog, hasn't it? And always, if you go through the various things that have happened through the years, from Peterloo and through the amazing people who wouldn't handle pick cotton in the mills, to the suffragettes, people have always stood up for the underdog. And I think British people kind of love that about Manchester. I think there's been the voice for those who needed a voice, and it's been the kind of radical challenge to London, isn't it? So, the Guardian has kind of also been a big part of that. That's another Manchester thing that we gave to the world. And I said to Kath today, we're looking forward to not just temporarily welcoming them back today, but obviously one day permanently welcoming you all back to where it all began.
Helen, we have to be careful, don't we? Manchester's great history, but you don't want to put it in a glass case, because all of this is still relevant. The Pankhurst, the
Indeed,
LGBT story we
I
talked
was
about.
about to say also, there's Manchester City and then there's Greater Manchester, and there's inequality within Greater Manchester. And I think that has to be very much part of the agenda of change, is to see how those inequalities can be addressed. And it's Greater Manchester that needs to be the beacon, that needs to be the soul, not just Manchester City.
No, I agree with that, Helen, absolutely. But there is something about this place that's always been bound up with the people's history. I mean, Mark will talk about, obviously, the LGBT rights movement. It's always done that, hasn't it? And so it's always kind of sort of been there told the people's history, as opposed to the story of the wealthy and the powerful. And long may that be the case.
Talking of which, last question to Kath, I think. Joe Faulkner asked as well, can the Guardian do more to show the rest of the country the way to a better, more equal Britain? Speaking of someone who works for the Guardian, we are trying our best, but I don't know if you have an answer to that question, because it sort of reflects what we've been talking about, and certainly what C.P. Scott brought to the paper. How do you see that ethos and spirit looking ahead?
Yeah, I mean, I think what C.P. Scott and his sort of Mancunian vision inspired us to think is that it is about the facts, but it's not only about the facts. It is about clarity, but it's also about imagination. I think just the facts aren't enough. You need to give people the ideas, the sort of concepts, the sort of imagination, the vision to sort of imagine a better world. And our job is to do both of those things. And I think if you can do both of those things, then you have the kind of hopeful vision that he tried to instill in us.
Truly Mancunian vision. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Tim, Henrietta, Kath, Mark, Helen, and Andy. That was a fascinating discussion. I wish it had gone on for another hour and a half, about a fascinating history, fascinating city, and crucially as well, a fascinating future.
Yeah,
we've not been used to talking about the future over the last year, and I think slowly we're sort of getting used to doing that again. So that was great. Thank you to everybody who came. A huge number of people registered and were present for that. It's strange when we can't see you, but we really appreciate you doing it. If you like that event, if you like what The Guardian does, if you're aware of The Guardian's esteemed Mancunian history, we are a paper which now has a membership model. We're not owned by a horrible, big, beastly private interest. And the help of our readers and their involvement and their donations are really, really important. So think about that as well. That only leaves me to say thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody who tuned in. Thank you, Manchester. And we'll see you in the non-virtual world. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone.